Welcome everybody. My name is Lauren, for those of you who don't know me. Some of you do. And yeah, we'll get right to it. So today I want to talk to you about something that is very near and dear to me, and something that I spent the last year of my time at Goddard researching and studying and applying on myself and my friends and anybody who will listen. And yeah, I'm very excited to share with you all of this cool stuff that I've learned over the past year. And so today I want to talk to you about depression. Not only what it is, but also how to recognize it in yourself and perhaps in others. And then I'm going to teach you a few strategies that you can implement in your own life to help build what I like to call an antidepressant lifestyle. So we'll get right to it. I'd like to start with a question, which you're free to answer. Let everyone shuffle in. Sorry. There's lots of floor space if you want to hop in. Yeah, so my question to you is, what is depression? You're welcome to raise your hands or shout it out.
Isn't there like a whole list of, clinically speaking, there's like a whole list of things,
Mm-hmm.
and if you check off enough of the boxes, then you're depressed?
Right? Yeah. Yeah, anybody else? Sadness?
Disconnection with what you want to do, but your body somehow doesn't do.
It's like hopelessness, helplessness, and then I think one, and there are two different kinds too, or maybe many, but one is like a circumstantial sort of thing that can happen to most people, maybe even multiple times throughout their lives, and then one is like a clinical thing, which is like a imbalance of chemicals in the brain that's like a lifelong thing.
Thank you. It's an overwhelming inability to function in life.
Anybody else? Great. Yes, so depression is all of those things, really. And on top of that, depression is an illness. It's a mental illness, and just like heart disease or the flu or a broken leg, it deserves treatment and care. So for many of us, perhaps, depression and mental illness in general might seem like something kind of nebulous, something outside the realm of possibility in our own lives. At least that's how it felt for me, until I experienced it personally. So a couple of years ago, I was suffering from, as you said, all of those symptoms of depression, right? Which we'll go through in another minute. But I didn't have a name for it, and for a long time I didn't realize that the low mood, fatigue, irritability, lack of interest that I was experiencing was part of a larger problem. Largely, I felt that there was something wrong with me, something that I was fundamentally lacking, some sort of strength, that I'd allowed this to happen to me and I couldn't seem to shake it off, as seemed to be the advice of many. But as I worked on healing and through my studies here at Goddard, I've come to find that it's not something I was struggling with alone. In fact, throughout the world, more than 350 million people struggle with depression every day. It's about 5% of the population. And in the United States, it's now more than 1 in 10. So that's a staggering statistic, considering how debilitating and potentially life-threatening depression can be. On top of this, despite how many people suffer from depression, we still don't know exactly what causes it. There is, as of yet, no blood test or MRI scan to diagnose depression. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that we know enough about depression to be able to treat it and to reverse some of the effects that it can have on our brain and on our body. So if there's no MRI scan or blood test to diagnose it, how do we know if we have depression? As was mentioned earlier, there's a really nifty list of symptoms. And for right now, if you have enough of these symptoms, you're diagnosed with clinical depression. And those symptoms include a depressed mood, which can be feeling sad, empty, or even constantly irritable or angry, which was something I learned. A decreased interest in normally pleasurable activities, fatigue or a lack of energy, insomnia or an increased desire to sleep, so I'm quite polar opposites there. A significant weight gain or weight loss, a significant increase or decrease in appetite, trouble thinking or concentrating, trouble making decisions, chronic unexplainable aches or pains, feelings of worthlessness, self-loathing, or excessive guilt, and finally, recurrent thoughts of self-harm or suicide. Now, generally speaking, and in accordance with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, if you have 5 or more of these symptoms concurrently for more than 2 weeks, you're diagnosed with clinical depression. And on top of that, at least one of those symptoms must be a depressed mood or a lack of interest in pleasurable activities. And originally, the common view of depression was that you either had it or you didn't. But according to more recent research, especially done by a couple of researchers at Harvard University, depression tends to operate on a spectrum, which you'll see here, with normal mood ups and downs, right? Because everyone's got good days and bad days, all the way over to severe major depressive disorder. Now, most people who suffer from depression fall somewhere in this gray end. And no matter whether you're diagnosed with clinical depression or you're experiencing a full-blown depressive episode or not, these symptoms can still have a really heavy effect on your ability to function in everyday life. So if you happen to be looking at the list of symptoms thinking, that sounds like me, or it sounds like something I've gone through, what can you do about it? What are your options? So the first thing I'd urge you to understand is that depression is not your fault, and that there are a number of treatment options available that can help you feel better. So just like there are things that you can do to improve your immunity towards, say, the flu, there are also things you can do to strengthen your immunity toward depression. And that's what I'd like to talk about today and for the rest of this talk, so that you'll walk away with something you can use in your own lives. So for my final project, I detailed multiple strategies for what I now call my antidepressant lifestyle. And these strategies fall into 3 categories: the power of thoughts, the mind-body connection, and food and mood. And within each of these categories, I'll share one strategy that you can use to build your own antidepressant lifestyle. So first, we're going to talk about the power of thoughts. So we can sometimes, we have a tendency to believe on occasion that what happens to us in life determines our happiness or our misery. However, at least in my experience, some of the happiest people I know are people who've experienced incredible hardship. And some of the most oppressed have been privileged, smart people who seem to have everything. So if our life circumstances truly dictated our happiness, only those with perfect health, wealth, and easy lives would be happy. But this is simply not the case. In fact, according to research, it's not what happens to you that makes you happy or depressed. It's generally how you interpret what happens to you or your beliefs about the situation that determine your happiness. Psychologist and researcher Dr. Albert Ellis developed what's known as the ABCs of emotion to help us better understand how our interpretation of and our reaction to situations can influence our mood. So A, as you can see over here, we'll get to the diagrams later, but A is for the activating event, or the challenging situation that you encounter. B is your belief about the event, or your interpretation of what has happened. And C is the consequence of the event, both emotional or behavioral. So let's look at an example. Imagine that you call your friend, and she doesn't answer. This is A, the activating event, or potentially challenging situation that you just encountered. Upon her not answering the phone, your mind conjures images of her purposely ignoring the phone call. You start to think maybe she's mad at you, or worse yet, she never really liked you at all. Your mind spirals into these really negative thoughts, and you wonder, like, what's wrong with me? Why doesn't she want to talk to me? The mind does crazy things, goes crazy places. It's a tricky thing. So your day is ruined, and you're worried that you've lost a friend, and you let this bad mood kind of color your day. This is your belief about the event. Consequently, you convince yourself, yep, she must not be my friend, because a real friend would answer the phone. You're upset, and you let this bad mood color your day, and when your friend calls back in the evening, you're short-tempered with her, and you don't treat her very well. She leaves the phone call feeling hurt and pretty confused, and your friendship suffers a blow. This is the consequence of your belief. Now we can look at this same situation in another way. So you call your friend, and she doesn't answer. This is your activating event, same event. Instead of getting upset, you can think of all the activities that your friend is involved in and consider that she probably missed the call because she's just busy. You know that she's your friend and she'll call you back when she gets a chance. This is your belief or interpretation of the situation. So your friend calls back in the evening and you have a nice chat. She apologizes for missing your call and tells you about the busy day she's had at work and how her boss is really hard on you. She thanks you for your friendship and you make plans to meet at the end of the week. This is the consequence. So even though this is a minor example, it illustrates how our beliefs can influence our emotions and actions. When we encounter situations like this, we're often not aware that our reactions are even a choice. Our thoughts are so automatic that we can even end up blaming the other person or the situation for our own unhappiness. Negative thoughts can lead to negative moods and even spiral into depression. So how can we use this information to change our own lives? There's an exercise that I really like called cognitive reframing. It's taken from cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive reframing is taking negative thoughts and sort of putting a new perspective on them. And it's not positive thinking or putting on rose-colored glasses because sometimes life is really difficult and it's definitely important to acknowledge that. However, when you're depressed, the way our brains are wired means that we're more likely to see the negative in each situation. So reframing negative thoughts is meant to help you examine your thoughts and make reasonable judgments about them. So the goal is realistic thinking rather than blindly positive thinking. Now the practice works like this. When you catch yourself thinking a negative thought, you can write it down or record it on your iPhone or whatever's available. Then you try your best to look at it objectively without any judgment. If it's easier, you can pretend that you've heard a friend say this, and then you'll feel a little less emotionally attached to that thought. Then you can think of ways to actively reframe or test the validity of this thought. Are you overgeneralizing by drawing large conclusions from little evidence? Are you thinking in polarizing extremes that leave little room for a middle ground? Are you letting your emotions color your thoughts? Or are you assuming that you know what another person is thinking without knowing for certain? Each of these thinking traps is easy to fall into and can make situations feel a lot more negative than they may actually be. So once you've asked yourself a few of these questions about your negative thought, you can start to test the validity or truth of this idea. Since thoughts are more like opinions than facts, this is a useful exercise, but that can often be tough to remember when it's in the moment. So you can do this by putting your thought on a mini trial with you as the judge. You can take your negative thought and you can gather evidence to support it. Then you can take that same negative thought and gather a little bit of evidence to disprove it. And then once you've gathered the evidence for both sides, you can objectively decide which one is more accurate or come to a conclusion somewhere in the middle. So let's look at an example. So let's say you get a grade back on your final exam, or you get a packet response from your advisor, and you find out that you failed, or that you have a lot more work to do. And your first response could be, "Ugh, I'm so stupid, I can't do anything right, why do I even try?" You can recognize this as a negative thought and apply the technique that you've just learned. So you can write down the thought or record it somehow, and then see if you can find evidence to back it up. Your evidence could be, I failed this test, and it's definitely going to affect my grade. I studied and I still failed, so I must not be able to learn this topic. Okay? Next, you can see if you can find any evidence to disprove this idea. You may determine, well, this is actually the first test I failed in this class. My grades are otherwise pretty good, and I probably could have studied a little more. So after you look at both sides, you can come to a conclusion, maybe I'm not perfect, but I worked hard and I tried my best. This test didn't go so well, but it doesn't mean that the next one won't go well. I can learn from my mistakes and study better for the next test. So this would be a more realistic view of the situation and more encouraging for you to keep trying in the future. Letting unchecked negative thoughts run the show can lead us into negative moods that can eventually spiral into depression. By practicing this exercise consistently, you can learn to shift your perspective and develop a more realistic interpretation of events. When you create some distance between yourself and your negative thought, you get to choose how you react in these situations. The more you practice it, the easier it gets, and it will become more automatic, so you don't have to sit there with a notebook all day. So the next area that I'd like to talk about is the mind-body connection. Our mind and our bodies are intricately connected, and what we do with our bodies has a direct effect on our brains and ultimately our mood. So before we get into the details, I'd like you to try something with me. It's nothing complicated. So just, move your body a little. You can stretch your shoulders. You can reach your arms up if you want. Stretch out a little. Now that you've been sitting here listening to me for 20 minutes. All right. Once you've found a comfortable spot, if you would like, you can close your eyes. If not, just let your gaze fall somewhere in front of you. Now we're going to take a deep inhale through our nose together, in for a count of 5, and then we're going to hold it for 2 breaths and exhale through our mouth for a count of 8. So I'll count it together. Everyone inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 1, 2, and exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. One more time. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold, 2. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you'd like, you can open your eyes. Thank you. So this is a simple yet effective way to calm your nervous system, reduce the effects of stress, and improve clarity and focus. Now let's talk about why and how this works. So we all go through periods of stress in our lives. We've got work, school, friends, family, hobbies, you name it. And occasionally, or maybe more than occasionally, these activities can be stressful. This kind of stress is pretty common and can actually be good for us. Stress helps to motivate us, push us towards accomplishing our goals, and can keep us from getting bored. But when we have too much stress over a long period of time, it can start to affect our bodies and our brains and our moods. We can start to feel fatigued or cranky, we can lose sleep or our appetite, and eventually we can feel like we're barely keeping our heads above water. This kind of stress is the stress that can hurt us. When we encounter stress or perceive a situation as threatening or challenging, a few things start to happen in our bodies. We'll undergo what's called a stress response. And the stress response starts in the brain. When we encounter a stressful situation, our eyes and ears send signals to the amygdala, the part of the brain that contributes to emotional processing. And when the amygdala perceives stress or danger, it sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus acts like a command center and essentially presses the gas pedal on our flight or fight response. Our body responds by releasing hormones called cortisol and adrenaline, which increase our heart rate and blood pressure, open up our blood vessels and pupils, and release blood sugar to give us a boost of energy. And while these systems are getting fired up, others, deemed less important in a crisis, start to shut down, including digestion and our immune system. Now once the threat is over, our body pumps the brakes on the stress response and things start to return to normal. Our heart rate goes back down, our breathing slows, and we essentially go back to business as usual. The problem happens when we encounter chronic stress, or continued stress over a long period of time. If we kept the gas pedal down on a car for a really long time, we would eventually run out of gas. Similarly, when we're constantly stressed out, we can start to feel like we're running out of gas. Our energy levels get depleted, we're more susceptible to illness since our immune system is suppressed, and we can have difficulty sleeping or concentrating. These are all bodily signs that are also symptoms of depression, which is why it's very important to understand how to deal with stress when we encounter it so it doesn't lead to chronic stress or a depressive episode. So this simple breathing technique slows your heart rate down, calms your nervous system, and encourages your body to return from a state of stress and alert to calm and relaxation. Our bodies and minds are intricately connected, and this is just one quick way to improve your mood over time. And in the last section, I'd like to talk about food and mood. So in English, we have plenty of fun phrases to suggest the relationship between food and mood. Sugar rush, food coma, hangry. Culturally, we know that food unquestionably has an effect on our mood. But when we talk about depression or mental illness, food is rarely brought up as a contributing factor. Maybe it seems too simple that for such a debilitating illness, food could be part of the answer. However, for some, food is a very good place to start. Our bodies, and more specifically our brains, need food to function, but not any food will keep our brains and bodies healthy. Michael Pollan, author of several books on food and the American diet, including In Defense of Food, sums up some recommendations quite nicely. He says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. While simple in nature, putting this idea into practice can be surprisingly difficult when facing the shelves of a North American grocery store. So where I would recommend starting when trying to shift to a more mood-healthy way of eating would be to start with sugar, since it's everywhere and can have immediate and drastic effects on our mood. So sugar is a broad term for carbohydrate. Glucose, fructose, lactose, dextrose, and starch are all different names for sugar. There are actually over 50 different names for sugar, which can make it even tougher to recognize all the places in our diet that it tends to sneak in. When we eat sugar, the taste buds on our tongue send signals to our brain that activate our reward system by triggering the release of dopamine. Dopamine is that same feel-good chemical that's released in our brains when we're out with friends, exercising, having sex, or even having a cigarette. This is why so many people love sugary treats. Dopamine is also one of the neurotransmitters that can be notoriously low in people suffering from depression. While eating sugar in small quantities is generally not a very big deal, we're usually not eating small quantities. The World Health Organization recommends that we only get about 5% of our daily caloric intake from sugar. That's about 25 grams or 5 teaspoons. But most of us, maybe not here at Goddard, are eating between 3 and 5 times that much. At 39 grams or 8 teaspoons of sugar, a single 12-ounce can of soda puts us way past our daily limit. When we eat too much processed, refined sugar, our blood sugar levels spike far beyond a normal range. This leads to that sugar rush feeling. Our brain's reward centers light up like a Christmas tree, and we get a surge of that feel-good dopamine. But it doesn't last. This high is shortly followed by a crash, as insulin rushes in to level out our blood sugars. This crash can leave us feeling cranky, tired, stressed, which leads us to want more sugar to get up to a functioning level. This back and forth pattern of highs and lows can lead us craving a quick fix for our plummeting blood sugar and mood. To put this into practice in your own life, and to keep your dopamine circuits healthy and avoid the post-sugar blues, it would make sense to limit the amount of processed refined sugars that you put into your body. But this can be easier said than done. A good place to start is with sugary drinks. These contain huge amounts of sugars and generally are just empty calories, not leaving us feeling full or satisfied. So if you feel like making this transition, it's probably easiest to do it slowly. Instead of taking all sugary drinks out at once, you can try substituting 1 or 2 of your daily sodas or juices for water or tea. Each day or week, you can substitute 1 more until you've phased out sugary drinks for good. If you're used to drinking a lot of soda or juice, this can help you avoid the headaches or fatigue that can sometimes happen when you try to cut it out too quickly. It also gives you a bit of wiggle room in case you forget. The next way to help phase out sugar is to know where to find it. And as I said earlier, there are over 50 names. I think it's something like 56 names for sugar, and it sneaks into a lot of places that we wouldn't normally expect it. Roughly 75% of packaged foods in the grocery store contain some form of added sugar. So it's important to check the labels on what you're buying. The closer sugar or any of its nicknames is to the top of an ingredient list, the more there is in that food. So if you see sugar in the first 3 to 4 ingredients, it's probably an indication that there's too much. Ideally, you could look for foods that haven't really been processed, because they won't have added sugar. Things like fruits and vegetables, grains and legumes, some organic meats or fish. On top of that, there are plenty of other ways to get more dopamine into your brain without snacking on sugar. Exercise also boosts dopamine levels as well as adds endorphins. So if you're feeling a slump, you can, instead of reaching for a candy bar, you can try going for a quick walk, doing some jumping jacks, even just walking around your office and stretching is a good way to do that. So to start shifting your eating patterns to improve your mood, sugar is a nice place to start. So we've talked about thoughts, we've talked about stress, we've talked about food, and how they all can contribute to depression. And there's just a couple of thoughts that I'd like to leave you with. So despite extensive evidence to the contrary, and the vast reach of depressive illness across the world, depression is still often viewed as a character flaw or weakness. Dr. Andrea Malizia, a psychiatrist of Bristol University, says that, quote, "For some reason we have a certain arrogance of the mind, that things like motivation, concentration, well-being, energy, and so on should be things that we are able to control," end quote. In reality, though, these functions are largely dependent on our brain circuits, which can be influenced by numerous factors, both internal and external, including thoughts, genetics, physical practices, injury, or even the food that we eat. Dr. Andrew Lutter of UCLA says that there's still a tendency, unfortunately, to think that you can get over depression on your own, that it's just a sign that you're not trying hard enough, that it's a sign of weakness to be depressed, and people need to get past that. Depression is not a weakness or character flaw or something to just get over. It'll take some work and most likely some outside help in a lot of cases, but there are certainly ways to get through it. I hope that some of these strategies can be useful to you and that you'll share them with others. So on top of the research that I did here at Goddard, I also created an online course that's made up of all the information that I found here, that I've tested on myself, that I've tested on, friends and family, whether they knew it or not. So all of what I've shared today, plus a whole lot more, is put into this course. It's designed to be a self-study through 20 videos and a 50-page workbook, and it teaches you how to create healthy habits and rewire your brain to be more depression-resistant. It goes through the neuroscience of depression, it shares healthy recipes, mindfulness techniques, physical exercises, yoga postures, and a whole lot more. As you can see, it's all available online. So if you are interested in the course or just getting more information on it, so it's got a whole bunch of videos that look like this. Thanks. It was really hard to find one where I wasn't making a weird face. Anyway, it looks like this. So we've got videos and a workbook with tables in it you can fill in. This is the exercise we did with the cognitive reframing. And if you are interested, there are some cards up here with the website on it for you to download the course if you'd like. And before I close out for questions, I'd just like to thank a couple of very special people. First of all, Harj for A, putting up with all this research for the last year, and B, for helping me make it look as good as it does. And I'd also like to thank Suzanne for being my guiding light through the last semester, and Catherine for being my second reader, and my family who's over here for all of their support and encouragement. Thank you very much for coming. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Oh, there's a Facebook page.
I've got a question.
Yes.
With the course, if you get enrolled in it, can you go back through it and redo?
Yeah, you have lifetime access.
Okay.
And you can download that workbook and print it out as many times as you want.
Cool.
Anything else? Okay. Yes.
I'm just so happy to hear this and to have you talk about sugar. I've been involved in Overeaters Anonymous for years, and their premise among, a 12-step program is sugar and flour.
Oh, okay.
And there's plenty of research on both of them. But what I find is that professionals in the mental health field don't necessarily buy into the power of sugar. They really believe that any kind of psychotropic drug might do a better job. And I just don't hear enough about sugar and its what I find to be addictive qualities.
Absolutely.
So I really appreciate your presentation.
Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's more of just like, do you have anything to add on this, to this line of thought? I have some friends who have talked to me about their struggle with depression and telling me that feeling disempowered by their doctor's input that their problem is a neurological imbalance that they were born with or is genetic, and saying that and feeling that their only cure is meds. And while I think that the neuroscience is a really awesome area of understanding, example because of the sugar connection, I can't help but feel like most of it is largely paid for and promoted by the pharmaceutical industries. And I was just wondering if you had anything to add to that, because it's my suspicion.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with that. I didn't really touch on pharmaceuticals in my paper just
Right.
because it's such an enormous,
Right.
I don't know, just beast of a thing, really. But yeah, in my personal experience and with, for me at least, it wasn't really the best option. But I know a lot of people that it really helps.
Right.
But I think that, yeah, shifting to a more like patient empowering sort of practice is really something that needs to happen. Because, yeah, people who are suffering from depression feel like they don't have an option. They go to their doctor who's supposed to be a professional and have their best interests at heart, but they don't maybe have enough time to deal with them, or they aren't educated on the other aspects of depression.
I feel like that's so important, the education on the other aspects of it. It's
Exactly.
totally missing.
Yeah, it's just missing. And so
Yeah.
I hope to add my voice to that conversation and kind of push that forward really.
That's great. I'm glad that
greatly.
you're doing that.
Yeah, I hope that answers that. Yes.
I could identify in your piece the parts of pranayama, yoga, breath practices, and I really liked hearing you bring that in. I thought that was cool. And I also wanted to ask you about your this was something you did, your experience with going through and sort of finding these different resources and finding other resources that have an opposite belief. Like one thing that I'm pinpointing is I came across this really interesting TED Talk. I love TED Talks. That was sort of discussing the effect of belief, particularly about stress, and how stress, and I mean chronic stress being sort of a different part of this, but people's belief about stress being terribly bad for their health heavily affecting the way it impacted one's body. So while I am hearing two different parts of your piece that identify the separation, I'm really curious about maybe some encounters that you've had where people have said, oh, maybe sugar is better for you, and how you kind of navigated this. Because there's a lot about depression that's unknown, as you identified. So I'm kind of curious about what your personal experience is like in walking through some of the contrasting aspects of this step.
Well, depression on its own is a really sort of interesting illness because it's an illness of mood and how you feel, right? So it's very subjective. And I was listening to a TED Talk the other day, and he told a story about, so he said if you have cancer and you say that standing on your head every day makes you feel better, you'll still have cancer and you still might die. However, if you have depression and you find that standing on your head every day makes you feel better, you're essentially not depressed anymore because you feel better. So I'm sort of the line of thought that whatever makes you feel better, not necessarily in a sort of instant way, is, you know, that's your prerogative, right? So yeah, it's hard to sort of navigate that, right? When people are like, sugar makes me feel awesome. I'm like, you know, I might for now, but wait 10 years, I don't know. So yeah, it's tricky to sort of navigate those, and I'm not really sure how you, because you can't force people to do anything, right?
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I don't have a very good answer to.
That's okay. You don't have to have an answer. My question wasn't super well formed, but.
Yes.
Lauren, can you speak a little bit to what inspired you to
To
create the course?
To create the course, well, I guess initially, when I was sort of dealing with this on my own, I was living in Taiwan, where English resources were not available. So I couldn't just go meet up with a psychotherapist. Going to a doctor to get drugs or something just really wasn't an option. So then I was kind of left going, what do I do? And happened to stumble across a yoga class, which a friend was teaching, and all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, that felt awesome, which was sort of a new thing. And yeah, started doing that more and more, and that was, I guess, sort of the snowball effect, and that's kind of what started it all, was yoga. But it was really the unavailability of resources. And I thought that I couldn't be the only one who was dealing with that. And so I figured maybe if someone had a little bit of a roadmap that you could do in your house and you wouldn't have to go anywhere, maybe it would be an easy way to start to make yourself feel better. So that's where this kind of started. Thanks. Yes?
Are you doing anything with this after your senior study, or is this a discrete, like this was my project?
No, it all goes public on March 1st. So it'll be available for purchase actually. So I've turned this into a business that I'm now running, along with some like coaching that goes along with the course. Yeah, so that'll be my new full-time gig actually.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Good for you.
And you've been doing some life/health coaching
Yeah, so I'm also
kind of internationally,
Yep,
be it before this, eh?
exactly. Yeah, so I'm also a certified health coach and counselor. So I do that as well. Any other questions?
I thought it was interesting with the physiological affecting the psychological. I think there's so much more of that. I know with the neurological aspects of it, I know Beth, she's a chiropractor, and she deals a lot with the neuroscience that involves with this, rather than the pharmaceutical end of things, which was what I was interested in that comment about, and trying to reinvent how we treat ourselves and treat each other, rather than just going, take 2 pills and call me in the morning, you know, the classic, or here you need an antidepressant, or here you need this pill or that shot, or what have you, and how much there's available to us that we're not, you know, like you say, creating a resource like this. And I know with Beth's introduction into that neuroscience portion of our physiology and how it affects us so dramatically, I think there's a really good tie in there. I think there's some excellent positive effects that we can have on ourselves.
Yeah, it's very interesting how closely connected all of those things are, and how we tend to treat the mind and the body as separate, even though
So wrong.
it just doesn't make sense when you look at who we are as humans. Yeah, and so often we don't look into, you know, you say you're depressed, okay? You come into your doctor, but we very rarely get asked, what are you eating? How are your friends? How's your relationship with your family? Do you get out and do things? Like, you know, there's so many factors that can affect how we feel and how we interact with the world, that it's really nuanced, and I don't think it's always treated as such a nuanced sort of issue. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
Yeah, so I have a question. First, I love you. And then I think it's first incredible that you're doing this, because when you are depressed, the last thing you want to do is go out and find help.
Yep.
So the fact that you can do this at home is incredible. Second thing is, a lot of what you have mentioned is stuff that I learned, whether it was IIN or like a previous like counselors or therapists that I've seen, like the first exercise you had, my therapist actually had me do. And it would totally change the way I view things now. So I know for a fact that it works. But my question is, I know you're gonna launch the course and everything, it's gonna be great. And do you foresee like when people buy your course, like, and maybe they like email you or message you or whatever, contact you in some way, do you foresee you taking on like clients that go through this course and being like, yeah, let me counsel you in this, and we'll talk about food and exercise, and we'll also talk about your depression and, you know, the course itself and things like that. So like in addition to having the course, are you gonna be there for these people that take it, basically?
Yes, that's exactly my plan, is to, also have that sort of one-on-one coaching available. There's also like a private Facebook group just for students of the course, so they can also interact with people who are going through similar things. There's a forum on the course that you can chat with me. My email's on that card, you can ask me whatever you want.
That's awesome.
So I plan to be quite available for all of that.
That's awesome.
I think we have like 3 minutes left if anybody's got anything else. If not, I will just say thank you very, very much for coming.